So, as promised, I brought in a real live anthropologist to talk about culture. So, Dr. Rodgers is going to speak a little bit. I asked her to speak on group-related cultures versus maybe our American, more individualistic cultures. So, without further ado.
Thanks to our ancestors, and because of our ancestors' ingenuity, our ancestors figured out ways to produce, store, and distribute food surplus. When that happened, job specialization began to happen because you didn't have to be involved every day finding subsistence just to keep you alive. Prior to the existence of food abundance, individuals were directly linked to the survival of the group. Your ability to survive as an individual was linked to that of the group. If you were ill, if you were a female and you had a small child, if you had some type of broken bone and you were able to hunt for yourself or protect yourself, the group took care of that. And so as an anthropologist, we look at ostracization. Do you know what that is? When they kick you out and don't have anything to do with you. That's the ultimate penalty, because you're probably in historic and prehistoric times, you're probably going to die because you couldn't survive on your own and produce enough food to protect yourself, get the clothing you need, et cetera, et cetera. So particularly for the bulk of human history, that direct contact to group safety has existed. And I was telling your professor that if we had any sense, we'd still realize that that's actually true. But there are still enclaves of groups who started out with the good of the group coming before the individual. And I like to put it this way: individuals, even in those cultures, have always been able to act as individuals as long as it didn't endanger the group. That was the definition of freedom within that culture. So if you look at a lot of cultures as far as sexual orientation, a woman who was not interested in being childbearing, had no desire to cook, scrape hides, all that stuff, could go be a warrior. A male that felt more compelled, it didn't endanger the group. You could express your individuality as long as it didn't endanger the group, because you were tied to the group for your own survival. And if you endangered the group, then you endangered everyone's survival. So we know that cultures who have recently been what I would call tribal, that have lived in smaller groups historically, and particularly confined geographic areas, still hold to those premises. In education, it manifests itself, and I've seen this working with Pueblo groups in the Southwest. Classroom, you ask a question, and students are raising their hand wanting the recognition. And what happens often with native students in those cultures, even if they're very bright, if the teacher's calling on them, praising them, lifting them up, saying, gosh, you know, in so many words, I wish everybody was like you. And, you know, what you will see happening is that student bringing their participation down and averaging themselves out so they're not held above the group. The best thing to do in that instance is take that student who excels in math or whatever it is and have them help those who don't, so it brings up the totality of the group. So I often think about my own culture, which is Native. We have people that come to visit our tribe with every kind of economic development scheme, quest that you can imagine. And they come in and they make a proposal. And in my culture, we don't air our dislike, our arguments between us. We don't do that in public. So you have these people leaving and they say, boy, that went really well, didn't it? And I just smile because until I go back in that room, I don't even know how, because they haven't shown that. So you go back in the room, and probably the most famous culture that's known for this would be the League of the Iroquois, who were in Michigan, Wisconsin, New York. When they made a decision about planting, moving, treaties, agreements, they looked 7 generations ahead to see what the effects would be on the people. Can you imagine? It's like, I don't think we'd have an ecological problem if we did that, you know. And then the Iroquois, yes, they outstripped the Great Lakes area of beaver because they became involved in a capitalistic venture and were quite taken with the income, et cetera, so nobody's perfect. But still, it's groupthink. If I do this today, if I make this decision for this group of people today, what is the effect going to be on my group in 7 generations? That's quite a thought process. And it means, I think for most people doing business in a Western way, the thing that's most frustrating, it means it takes a long time for that. How would you sit down and figure out, even 2 generations ahead, what is the effect going to be? Is it going to be positive? Is it going to be negative? But they're interested in the sanctity and safety of the group. And in some ways, you're too young to remember when President Reagan sent some very high-up business leaders to Japan, but he did. One of them was Lee Iacocca, who happened to be head of Chrysler at the time. Lee Iacocca made it 3 days and had to come home. Because the sanctity of the group is important, the agreements you make with individuals, you've got to get to know the individual. You have to get, what do you want out of it? What are you getting out of it? What are we getting out of it? And you have to build a trust relationship. And that relationship almost always goes with groups that are interested in maintaining. Most of my information comes from Native peoples. The poorest place in the United States is a Native reservation. For school systems, unemployment, housing, across the board, it's the poorest place in the United States. And people are always going there and saying, the last one that I could talk about pretty well is disposing of nuclear waste on the reservation. And yes, it would have brought jobs, it would have brought money, but the leaders sat down and said, we need to think about this. And they decided that no, that would not be appropriate use of commonly held land, and it would not long-term benefit the people. So those are the types of things that you enter into when you're thinking about the good of the group over the good of an individual. And it's interesting because historically, tribal peoples have had difficulty dealing with Western cultures. In Western culture, let's see, we've had kings, we've had all types of monarchs, we have elected presidents, and what happens when Western peoples with that type of a history, they want to talk to the head person. They want to talk to the decision maker. When you have a group culture, you don't have one decision maker. And so no one actually has the decision-making capability. You can't just talk to me and I can say, yeah, the Miami tribe will go for that. It can't happen. And so even today we have business councils, we have tribal councils, and they meet and discuss and decide for the group as representatives. And of course, that's what we're supposed to be doing with our legislators. It's just not quite as removed as we feel from Washington, D.C. and the State House here in Kansas. It's more a direct link, mostly because we're pretty much related. These are groups of families that have come together over the years. And so you know their grandparents, you know their cousins. It's amazing when you're talking with people who have the emphasis of the good of the group. I mean, I know my grandparents, I know my great-grandparents, I know my aunts and uncles. I'm telling you, they know their second and third cousins and how they're related. Part of that has to do with kinship systems and trying to prevent incest. You had to know who you could marry and who you couldn't. So it became, and then the government reinforced that by, if you want to be a recognized Native person, you have to have what's called a certificate of degree of Indian blood. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs determines whether you're Indian or not. We jokingly call it our green card. No one else in the United States has to have a card to prove they're minority, but they used to, if we want the benefits. So when you're trying to conduct business, it requires a totally different approach and perspective. And you would have to make your prospectus geared toward longitudinal, long-term. This is going to benefit your people. So rather than glorifying a leader, you know, somebody, oh, I think, let's see, if I could get a grant of $2.5 million, I think the president would be pretty happy with me. But would I do that? It's not for me. It would be to benefit you. And even in those approaches, it becomes different motivation. And most business deals require some kind of motivation. You know, I used to be in sales, and one of my trainers used to say, nothing happens until a sale is made. Nothing gets manufactured, nothing gets transported, you gotta get the sale. So understanding how other groups think, whether it's family relationships, how do you build trust, what do they need to see from you so that they think it's going to be beneficial for the group long term. Those are how decisions are made, and they're not made by an individual human being. And we have countless in Africa, in South America, as well as the United States, we have countless examples of treaties being signed by one person who is from that tribe. They had no right. Nobody told them, Russ, you go sign this for us. They were just there, and they signed it. They thought it was a good deal. Maybe they got something out of it. Maybe their family got land, or maybe their family got money, but they had no right. And so it's been a tremendous misunderstanding. And so when you're doing business in this day and age, to know the individual cultures, particularly when it's groupthink, is pretty imperative. Do you have any questions? I don't think I even used my 15 minutes, did I?
No, very good. I thought about that. The questions.
Have you ever thought about what it would take, just in this group right here? Let me go back. When I was finishing my PhD, we had a library in Ohio State for anthropology only. And we found that one of our classmates was hiding material. We were preparing for our candidacy exam, and she was finding material and putting it behind the books and to keep us from getting it. And it was like, it doesn't hurt her if I do well. Me doing well isn't going to keep her from doing well. Mm-hmm. But it was very much an individualistic thing and a kind of a competition. And she ended up being ostracized. I can tell you that. But sometimes these things happen, and we're not quite aware that they're even happening in our midst, that there's a personal competition, even in classrooms like this, rather than working to make sure that the whole group is getting it. Now, that's Russ's job. So he has groupthink. But as individual students, it's just a different way to look That's the end of my speech.
Well, you guys think of a question, but I got a burning one.
Okay.
How much does individual self-interest still really play a big role, even in maybe ancient cultures, but maybe even more modern cultures that are more group-oriented? Let's say they're taught to say the group comes first, and then I suppose the real individualist ones, those are the ones that get ostracized anyway. But even as they interact, in your experience, how much of that is really going on, or is the nature still there that they're mostly self-interested? And as I've professed to the student, when I say self-interest, I don't mean selfish, but I do mean interested in things that are close to you, which might include Kayla's interest as well, or whatever.
Right.
So.
Well, in anthropology, we talk about two things, the real and the ideal.
Yeah.
If you ask somebody, what do you do in this instance? They'll give you the ideal. And in anthropology, that's why we do participant observation and try to live with the group for at least a year, because you cannot keep up the ideal for a year. You'll see it. You'll see how they actually interact. And yes, the worst cases involve leaders who have unethical or illegal self-interests and push those forward with different coalitions so that they actually earn money, earn fame, whatever the perk is, and they don't care about it. They don't care. Mostly, I would say today, particularly in Native groups, it's the structure that keeps that from running rampant. That the structure, even if you have a tribal chairperson, they cannot legally entangle the nation just on their own signature. So it requires some effort. You've got to develop a coalition, or you have to have meetings behind closed doors to get people to see it your way. But yes, it happens all the time. It does. But the structures that are put in place, because they're smaller and more personal than what we see on a national level in the United States Congress, are more likely to work. It's only, this is Beverly speaking, in the education of children that we see the ideal more often than we do in business transactions. Because, I mean, even if it's a reservation or it's Africa and they're living in the bush and there's a school, it's still a Western school. It's still a Western school. They're being taught the same way you were taught. No child left behind in all 9 yards. You know, so it's very infiltrated. However, there have been major efforts in Africa, in South America, as well as the United States, places in Asia, for natives and those individual groups to take back control of education. I've helped write early Head Start and Head Start programs for Pueblo groups, so that it does introduce and reinforce the good of the group. Be an individual, excel, do your best for the good of the group, and you're free to do that. And as I said, if you think about the world we live in, we would, I think, be better and logically, militarily, if we did step back just a tad to think about the good of the group, because we're just about down to one group. We're one group of human beings. It's global, but we don't often think about the effects of what we're doing worldwide.
Okay, questions? Made me think of another one.
Okay.
Was are they in some ways more savvy to economic way of thinking because of that? I'm trying to say when you brought up the recognizing other people's skills and that. My first question was going to be whether you thought they were more guilty type people, like they kind of run around with this guilt because they have this tension, like a lot of Americans struggle with, of I really want to do this, but that's more better for myself. Is that really good for the group, or what? Do they have that? Is there that guilt, or have they actually figured things out better? That, as Adam Smith would have said, their pursuit of their own self-interest is actually beneficial for the group, as long as they're running this balance. Yeah, the ideal. But they've actually figured it out maybe even better than.
From the things that I've witnessed, I used to do economic development. From what I've witnessed, I haven't seen what I would think of as guilt, more caution. It's like a pinprick in your conscience. Oh yeah, I think this is great. Oh, wait a minute, I need to. Because most people live just as you and I do. They're not isolated.
Mm-hmm.
They go to Walmart and everything that we do. But there's that pinprick of stepping back and saying, I need to re-examine this from a group perspective. And again, the structures that are in place usually help that happen.
Mm-hmm. Which would tell me they might be thinking more about those unintended consequences that sometimes more selfish people either A, don't care about, or B, don't think about.
If it's going to line your pocket, you don't care about the other person. And part of that, again, is because most of these groups have familial connections, and you're less likely to mess over your own family than you are some stranger.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I mean, most likely.
Yeah.
So, what's it?
What tribe are you from?
The Miami tribe of Oklahoma. Ever heard of it? I'll slip something in here. What battle gave the United States Army the worst defeat in its history? Thinking Indian stuff here. That's what most people respond, actually. It occurred in Ohio under the leadership of the war chief of the Miami tribe, Little Turtle, and he sent them scampering, and it was the worst defeat ever done.
And his name was Little Turtle. They got beat up by Little Turtle.
Michiganaqua. Michiganaqua. So the Miami we were removed from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, to Paola, Kansas. You all know where that is?
Mm-hmm.
Just up the road. So when you go in Baptiste Drive, Baptiste was the name of the leader that led the forced removal. It's not a migration. It was a forced removal.
Mm.
And we've been with the Ottawas we've known them forever. We were farmers, they were traders. It all worked out pretty well.
Mm.
So, and the Shawnee. And now we're all in Ottawa County, Oklahoma, in the town of Miami. And I say Miami because we don't have an E sound in our language at the end of words.
But it is written our Miami.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the sound indicates animate object. So people are alive. So, yeah. Anything else?
What did you say?
Beverly Rodgers. I'm the Dean of Arts and Sciences. Every now and then I get to teach first year seminar, but that's all I've got. I would love to teach a class on Native people. That's my passion. My office is on the first floor of admin right across from the rest. So if you have any questions, stop by. Send me an email. I'll be glad to respond. Thanks.
Thank you.